Hello, my name is Dr. Jackalyn Rainosek, and I'm with DTP-Leadership Group. And this is Hot Topic Bold Talk. And my title, podcast 160, is The Lie is the Strategy: How Power Governs Through Misdirection, Fear, and then Normalizes It. So, in the introduction, I want to talk about something. There's a difference in exhaustion from lack of clarity than from exhaustion of clarity. And let me tell you, there's a particular exhaustion that comes not from confusion, but from clarity. It is not the fatigue of trying to understand what is happening. It is fatigue of understanding what is happening too often and watching it happen again and again and again. That's what's happening to us. Many of us have clarity about what's happening, but it's happening again and again. It is the wariness of recognizing patterns, naming them accurately, and then seeing those patterns repeat with consequences or not having consequences, since the DOJ doesn't seem to have any consequences for their actions, or ICE. But what happens is, with no consequences, then it gets exhausting. And so we have to face that reality. So this is where I think many of us Americans are, and we find ourselves here. We're not bewildered by the politics we're seeing. We are dismayed by its predictability. Lies are not told because they are believable, because it's gotten to the place Trump lies so much that nobody believes, that has any sense believes him, because they're not being useful. Outrage that he manufactures with his anger and then threatens tariffs and then sees how he can maneuver and manipulate through speeches and get what he wants. It's ridiculous. It's a form of persuasion, but it shows no leadership. And all it is a distraction, which he constantly does. Now, institutions are strained not accidentally, but deliberately, to test how much damage they can absorb before they fall. And that's what is happening with our courts. And the Congress is currently controlled by the Republicans and intimidated by preventing some Republicans from speaking out. So we are stuck with an authoritarian president is systematically using all these methodologies, and his lies are more pervasive than ever because they are the strategy to wear people down and get what he wants. Now, podcast 160 is about his architecture of how he's creating this systematic process. And I want to show the connection between headlines, because we have a lot of things that are reported separately, but I see the connections. And that's the reason I'm doing these podcasts, because the Washington Post article on Jasmine Crockett is, as a daring Democrat to rethink electability. The Time report of the House committee votes to hold the Clintons in contempt in the Epstein probe. The Adam Sewers Atlantic article about Trump can prosecute anyone now, and the New York Times investigation after Trump's ultimatum. Greenland talks include sovereign U.S. base. The Washington Post reporting on the raid of a journalist, Hannah Nadesan, and the Times Senate poll shows that fewer than a third of the Americans believe Trump's second term has made the country better. These are not separate ideas. They are connected. They are symbolic of a political system increasingly governed by misdirection. The lie is no longer incidental to the power. The lie is his strategy. That's the lie. It keeps being his strategy. He lies, he threatens, then he gives speeches that are ridiculous, and then he intimidates people, and then he gets what he wants. It's not a thought out strategy at all for the betterment of America. It is all focused on what he can get that he wants for himself. Jasmine Crockett and the politics of fear are disguised as the question of whether she is electable or not. Whether can she be elected? Well, she's a representative, and now she's running for Senate. The Washington Post article, Jasmine Crockett is daring Democrats to rethink electability in this Senate race. In reality, it's about something far more consequential. It's about fear that operates inside American politics, particularly within the Democratic Party in Texas. And it happens other places as well, where the Republicans are dominating the state. But Representative Jasmine Crockett is routinely described as unelectable. The reasons offered are almost always framed as pragmatic concerns. Her tone is too sharp, her language too confrontational, her presence too polarized for a conservative state like Texas. But electability is really a neutral concept. It is a cultural judgment masquerade as political analysis. The controversy described in the Post article came from a dismissive comment in a popular comedy podcast, warning donors not to waste their money on Crockett, exposed how quickly these judgments surface. The backlash was immediate, particularly from voters who recognize a familiar pattern. Here's a Black woman being told that her audacity itself is disqualifying. Crockett's response was very clear. Democrats, she noted, have tried white men repeatedly in Texas and lost repeatedly. The only thing that strategy has proven is that white men can lose too. What has not been tried, seriously considered, is a candidate who refuses to sanitize the stakes and soften the truth for the comfort of voters who are not at risk, which is white people in America, and particularly in Texas. This debate matters because electability has become one of the most effective tools of internal suppression within the Democratic politics, and it's also in the Republican politics. It allows fear to present itself as realism. It frames caution as wisdom and courage as recklessness, and it often alienates the very voters the party claims it needs to mobilize. And for the Democrats, it's the young voters, the voters of color, and the infrequent voters who feel talked down to rather than spoken with. Crockett's style is with fury, directness, and unfiltered statements. It's described as polarizing, but polarization does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges in a political environment already saturated with grievances, spectacle, and dishonesty. Against that backdrop, her authenticity becomes disruptive. And that's what we need to do. We're getting a clue from her that we all need to use authenticity when we talk to people and stop backing down. There are plenty of people that hate what Trump is doing. Let's talk to them and tell them what is happening. What Crockett represents is not simply a different candidate profile. She represents a challenge to the assumption that survival requires silence, or at least careful muting. In an era when lies are rewarded with power, truth-telling becomes framed as risk. The inversion is not accidental. Epstein's, the Clintons, and congressional misdirection. Let's look at how it relates to Crockett's situation, because it does. If the Crockett debate reveals internal Democratic anxiety, the Time article, House Committee votes to hold the Clintons in contempt in Epstein probe. By doing that, we are seeing a new strategy by the Republican Party. The stated justification for holding Bill and Hillary Clinton in contempt was accountability in the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. But accountability in this contrast is selected by design. As Time reports, less than 1% of the Epstein files have been released. The Department of Justice missed a legal deadline to produce them, yet when Representative Summer Lee introduced an amendment to hold Attorney General Pam Bodie in contempt for failing to comply with the law, Republicans rejected it outright. So if it has something to do with the Democratic Party or some of the Democratic leaders, then they're going to attack. They're doing the same thing that Trump is doing. They are his little minions. Instead, the spotlight was redirected to familiar political adversaries. The Clintons' function here is not central figure in the Epstein investigation, but is narrative decoys to refocus so Trump will not be continually connected to Epstein, which he needs to be. They were friends for many years, and we know exactly what he did with one of the young girls that Epstein had. Their names trigger partisan reflections that drown out more urgent questions. Why has the Trump administration failed to release the Epstein files? Who benefits from that delay? And why is congressional oversight focused upon upward only when it can be weaponized downward? So it's supporting Trump and being oversight for Trump so it can really punish the Clintons or anybody else that is considered to be an enemy of Trump. The phrase "no one is above the law" is repeatedly named in these proceedings, but repetition does not equal sincerity here. Accountability that flows in only one direction is not accountability at all. It is performance. And so that's what the Republicans are doing. Trump performs, the Republicans perform. That's what he's teaching them to do. What makes this episode especially troubling is that some Democrats joined these votes, so they never paid any attention to what's happening. They don't even realize what's happening, lending bipartisan legitimacy to a process that functions primarily as a misdirection. Somebody needs to educate these particular Congress members that are Democrats that voted to support this. This is how abuse becomes normalized, not through universal bad faith, but through enough procedural compliance to make theater appear routine. And that's what we're in. We're in a theater. Let's talk about the Justice Department and how they weaponize retribution. And Sewer's Atlantic essay, Trump Can Prosecute Anyone Now, provides one of the clearest explanations of the most dangerous transformation underway, the effective capture of the Justice Department. And it is captured by Trump. So is the Congress. A year into Donald Trump's second term, the DOJ increasingly resembles a personal law firm for Trump rather than an independent institution. This shift was accelerated and effectively legitimized by the Supreme Court 2024 decision granting presidents absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. Get this very clear. He keeps doing illegal acts as president, but they've been allowed because of the 2024 Supreme Court decision, because he can't be criminally prosecuted for, quote, official acts. So that's the reason we're seeing all of this. As Sura explains, this concept has no textual basis in the Constitution, yet it has dismantled one of the most important barriers to authoritarian abuse. The consequences are no longer theoretical. The chairman of the Federal Reserve has revealed attempts by the Justice Department to blackmail him into lowering interest rates under threat of indictment. Governors, mayors, attorney generals, and former law enforcement officers face investigation for opposing the president. Meanwhile, we see federal prosecutors, I mentioned in the last podcast I did, that resist politically motivated cases by resigning rather than participating. They are letting us know what is happening. Trump has been remarkably open about his approach. He's publicly complained when his enemies have not been indicted. He has chastised U.S. attorneys for moving too slowly. What once would have triggered a constitutional crisis is now treated simply as ordinary politics. Seward argues convincingly that the Supreme Court ruling eliminated even the theoretical risk of accountability for Trump. Under this framework, corrupt uses of prosecutorial authority are not just tolerated, they are protected. This is not a breakdown of norms, it is a deliberate replacement of law with loyalty. Let's look at the immigration process that I think is very disturbing and shows projection of power. The New York Times article, Death of Cuban Detainee in El Paso ICE Facility is Ruled a Homicide, is not simply a report about one man's death. It is an indictment of an enforcement regime that is increasingly operating beyond meaningful scrutiny. Geraldo Lunas Campos, a 55-year-old Cuban immigrant, died while physically restrained by ICE guards at the Camp East, Montana detention facility in El Paso. Doesn't this sound familiar? This time we have a Cuban. We had George Floyd before. By police, not ICE. Now we have ICE doing the same thing. Federal officials initially described his death as medical distress. After press scrutiny, they called it a suicide. The county medical examiner ultimately ruled it as a homicide, citing asphyxiation due to neck and torso compression. These contradictions are not incidental. They reveal a pattern in which officials' narratives shift not to clarify the truth, but to blunt accountability. Witnesses reported seeing guards choke Mr. Campos. Two detainees who could collaborate these accounts now face deportation, a move that would effectively remove them from any judicial process. So this is not an anomaly. It is a reoccurring feature of immigration enforcement under the Trump administration. When oversight threatens power, transparency disappears. Radley Bacco, who works on police militarization, has long documented these dynamics, observed that the lies deployed in cases like this are not meant to persuade the public. They are meant to demonstrate dominance, to show that the government can act, explain itself poorly, and still face no consequences. In that sense, immigration enforcement has become a projection of power rather than an instrument of law. Polling underscores the disconnect between the public will and the government action. The New York Times and a poll show that while voters are divided on immigration policy itself, a strong majority, including more than 70% of independents, believe ICE has gone too far in their tactics. Yet the administration has doubled down. This is because the goal is no longer efficient enforcement. It is deterrence through fear, not just for immigrants, but for anyone who challenges the state's authority. The death of Mr. Campos is not isolated tragedy. It is part of a broader pattern in which immigrants are rendered rightless in practice, even if rights exist on paper. This erosion does not remain contained. It sets precedent that inevitably is going to spread. Trump's renewed fixation on Greenland has often been treated as absurd or even comical. That's what they've done with him throughout his political career. They give all kinds of justifications for what he's doing. But the New York Times investigation after Trump ultimatum, Greenland talks, includes sovereign U.S. bases, makes clear that beneath the bluster lies a coherent and dangerous view of power. According to the reporting, negotiations have included proposal to expand U.S. military presence in the Arctic, create sovereign American control over pockets of Greenland's territory, and restrict access to rare earth minerals by Russia and China. These discussions stopped short of Trump's publicly stated desire to own Greenland, but they nevertheless represent a significant departure from post-war norms respecting national sovereignty. Greenland is owned by Denmark. So now the United States is trying to get minerals that belong to Denmark so they can have it for themselves. And this is Trump's attitude. If I want it, I'm going to go get it. At the World Forum in Davos, Trump articulated this worldview openly. He mocked European leaders, misstated NATO's history and purpose, and framed American military dominance as justification for unilateral action. So he's not only doing this in the United States, but he's doing this worldwide. and look at it. He does unilateral decisions all the time. He intimidates people to get what he wants. It's not about the American people. It's about him taking stands because he's pissed off about something. He's angry with Denmark because they didn't give him the Nobel Prize. So he's going after this. And there are plenty of articles that have written about that statement I've just made. Commentators such as Brad Stevens and Jamel Bowie describe the speech as unhinged, but its internal logic is clear. This is a strongman diplomacy in which humiliation replaces negotiation and confusion replaces strategy. The purpose is not alliance building, it is dominance of whatever is happening. This approach has consequences. It erodes trust among allies, it emboldens adversaries, and it destables international norms that have for decades limited the use of raw force. Foreign policy becomes another area for misdirection where spectacle detracts from the absence of coherent strategy. There's no coherent strategy to Trump. He just wants something and he's going to get it. And so he uses bluster in order to substitute for any kind of competence. Silencing the press is scary. The Washington Post reporting on the federal raid of the journalist Hannah Nadesan's home marks one of the most alarming escalations in the administration's attack on democracy and accountability. Federal agents seized her phone, laptops, recording devices, and hard drives, materials that combine years of confidential sources and unpublished reporting. Think about it for a moment. An invasion of a journalist's home, and all of her things are taken. As the Post details in its court filings, this seizure immediately crippled Nadesan's ability to work. Tips from sources dropped to zero. Communication ceased. Her entire professional universe, as the filing described it, was effectively commandeered by the government. Historically, the United States has treated newsroom raids as extraordinary measures. Now it's gotten to where it is commonplace and it will spread. Recognizing that they totally threaten our news and the policies that they protect us by putting out true facts about things. That has been impacted. This is not an incident byproduct of national security. Please let me remind you of that. It is creating a barrier. It is creating a message to journalists that is unmistakable. Your sources are no longer protected, and the security of power carries personal risk. Authoritarian systems rarely begin by banning speech outright. What they do is by making speech so dangerous, uncertain, and costly. And that's what this raid has done. The New York Times sent a polls titled "Few Voters Say Trump's Second Term Has Made the Country Better," provides critical content for understanding why these strategies persist. There's so much fear by Trump that he's going to continue the strategies hoping to hang on to his power. Only 32% of the voters believe the country is better off than it was a year ago. That's his mega Republicans. A majority say Trump is focused on the wrong priorities, mishandled the economy, and made life less affordable. Yet within the Republican base, his little 32%, he's still high. And a significant share of Republicans believe Trump is on track to be one of the best presidents in American history. It's tragic. He is corrupt. He's done everything to make himself financially more successful than he's ever been. And he's done it with illegal actions that no other president's ever done. The administration does not need broad approval to govern aggressively. It needs a loyal base, which it has. A fragmented opposition. That's us. Here we have these Democrats voting with the Republicans about Clinton, when if they'd stuck and said no, then they would have been a part of the opposition. In a media environment saturated with distraction, and that's what's happening. If we have one journalist that's attacked like she was, then it causes other journalists to really wonder what they need to do. Lies in this context function less as persuasion than as insulation to cover what is really happening. They prevent shared reality from forming. Without shared reality, accountability becomes impossible. And to me, the most difficult thing is the moment that Trump got into office, this second term, the violence and intimidation and climate of fear has increased every day. The rise in political violence during Trump's second term is not an unrelated phenomenon. It's part of the game. As reported by the New York Times in its coverage of assassinations, threats, and candidate intimidation, fear has become a constant presence in American political life. Elected officials now weigh not only electoral consequences, but physical safety. Candidates opt out of public events. Families become targets. We know congressional members have been killed. Organizations like the Democratic Security Project now exist simply to help candidates survive running for office. We're supposed to be in a democratic nation. They need organizations like the Democratic Security Projects to run for office. Yes, the climate does not emerge spontaneously. It is cultured when leaders demonize opponents under the rule of law and normalizing. Look at it this way. Violence becomes thinkable when accountability disappears. So I end this podcast with the following. What unites all these stories, from immigration enforcement to foreign policy, from press intimidation to political violence, is not an ideology alone. It is a methodology that Trump is using. Misdirection, intimidation, and normalization. The lie is not a side effect of this system. It is an operating principle. Democracy rarely collapses in a dramatic fashion. It is eroded away gradually as citizens grow exhausted and institutions bend under sustained pressure. We have to support our courts. We have to support people that run for election that are going to support our democracy and eliminate those that will not support our democratic process. Podcast 160 is an act of refusal. a refusal to normalize the abnormal, a refusal to treat each abuse as isolated, and a refusal to stop naming what is happening simply because doing so is tiring. We have clarity today, so let's not despair. Clarity brings every reason for us to resist. If you appreciate what I'm doing in my podcast, please support me at Patreon. I also would love to hear from you. So my email is Jackalyn, Jackalyn, at DTP-Leadership.com. I'd love to hear from you. So thank you for listening, and I will end now.